Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today, we are going to be looking at Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes movies. Specifically, we are looking at the self-titled movie that came out in 2009, starring Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law, along with the sequel, A Game of Shadows. Now, this retrospective is going to be different than my others. With this, I'm going to focus more heavily on two things. The first being the actors' portrayals of these iconic characters, and the second being the mystery in each movie. So, spoilers ahead. You have been warned. If you want to watch these movies with no knowledge of how they play out, then stop watching this right now. I will still look at the creative team as I always do in all of my retrospectives. And as always, if you want the PDFs of my presentation files, head over to the blog MetrObeliskradio.blogspot.com and find the corresponding blog post to this episode, and the download link will be there. Without any further delay, let's tear right into Guy Ritchie's Sherlock Holmes movies. So now let's start with the creative team, and more specifically, I'm going to take a look at the director and the producers first. So obviously, Guy Ritchie directed these two movies. He's the guy that brought us Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, Snatch, Revolver, Rock'n'Rolla, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. And now, if you watch the Reinventing Sherlock Holmes special feature on the DVD or Blu-ray of the 2009 movie, Guy Ritchie does talk about how in his boarding school days, if the boys were good, then they got to listen to a Sherlock Holmes story that night. So it's pretty safe to say that he is at least familiar with the original source material. And now going into the producers, the main guy I want to knock out of the park first is Joel Silver. Now, this guy's fingerprints are all over this movie with the slow-mo shots and the way that the action is filmed. And because it's an action adventure, and this series does implement more specifically the bullet time for the Matrix series, and he served as the producer on the Matrix series as well, so makes sense why it's there. So the second guy would be Steve Clark Hall. He worked with Guy Ritchie as a line producer on Revolver and as a producer on Rock'n'Rolla. Then we go into Dan Lin, who basically made his producing career off of the success of these movies. Now, he would go on to produce the Lego movie, the Lego Batman movie, and the remake of It, along with its sequel, It Chapter 2. And finally, we get to Susan Downey, who is the wife of Robert Downey Jr. She was a producer long ago, and she produced Ghost Ship, Gothica, the remake of House of Wax, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang with Robert Downey Jr. and Val Kilmer. And she did produce Guy Ritchie's Rock'n'Rolla, The Book of Eli. The list goes on and on. Now we're going to get into the bulk of the creative team, and that's the writers. Now, obviously, we cannot ignore the original creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, for these movies, he's only credited with creating the characters. Neither of these movies were based on any of his prior works with Sherlock Holmes. So, let's start with looking at all the writers that were on the 2009 movie. We have Michael Robert Johnson, who wrote the screenplay and screen story for this movie. Now, this was his big break, as he would go on to write the 2014 film Pompeii, so take that for what you will. We then have Anthony Peckham, who also wrote the screenplay for this movie. Now, the only big movie that he wrote before this was Clint Eastwood's Invictus. You try saying that name fast 3 times. Then we have Simon Kinberg, who wrote the screenplay with Anthony Peckham. Now, he previously wrote X-Men The Last Stand and Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, he would move on to being a producer with the X-Men series after X-Men First Class, and even direct the final movie in the Fox X-Men universe, which was X-Men Dark Phoenix. And the last writer on the 2009 movie would be Lionel Wigram, who wrote the screen story with Michael Robert Johnson. Now, he would write two other Guy Ritchie movies. He would write The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and King Arthur Legend of the Sword. Now, Sherlock Holmes A Game of Shadows only had 2 writers on it, and that was Michelle and Kieran Mulrooney. They co-wrote this movie, and along with the 2017 Power Rangers movie, if that tells you anything about them. So now that we're done looking at the creative team, let's dive right into the actors' portrayals of these iconic characters. And we're going to start off with Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal as Sherlock Holmes. Now, in these movies, it comes across as more of a comedic tone, but you can tell that Sherlock is basically being Sherlock in the sense that he's sincere about everything that he's saying. I mean, look at the first time we meet Mary Morstan, Dr. Wance's fiancée, in the first movie, when he does his deductions and basically pisses her off in the process when she throws the wine on him and leaves. Now, and I know this because when someone is that high of an IQ on the bell curve, then the human emotion factor really just goes out the window. Now we move on to Jude Law as Dr. Watson. Now in this one, he's actually a much skinnier version of Watson. Watson before this was portrayed really as a fat guy, but most people forget that Dr. Watson was an Army veteran. So him being a lot skinnier, thus having a better build, would make the action sequences that he's a part of a lot more believable. Then we have Rachel McAdams as Irene Adler, and she's not a new character to the Sherlock Holmes mythos. Her first appearance was in a short story called A Scandal in Bohemia in 1891. Now, before the movies, this is all we saw of her. Future appearances in movie and TV always cast her as the love interest for Sherlock, and in this one, she's not only the love interest, but Guy Ritchie placed that original character as the only woman who could ever outwit Sherlock Holmes. Now let's dive into Mark Strong as Lord Blackwood. Now, this character was specifically created for the 2009 movie Sherlock Holmes, so there's really nothing I can compare him back to. Then we have Eddie Marsan as Inspector Lestrade, the bumbling detective who really only appears in the 2009 movie noticeably, while only being in a couple of scenes in its sequel, A Game of Shadows. In my opinion, there's not really enough screen time really to dig into Lestrade in this rendition of Sherlock Holmes. Then we see Kelly Riley as Mary Morstan, the fiancée of Dr. Watson in the first movie turned wife of Dr. Watson. Now, she's really a minor character when it comes to the short stories, but they make her big enough in the movies to warrant talking about her here. She really doesn't become important until A Game of Shadows, but even still, she's not really shown outside of being the fiancée or wife of one Dr. Watson. And now we get to the big boy in this series, and that is Jared Harris as Professor James Moriarty. Now, Moriarty is in the 2009 movie, but his face is not really shown. It's first shown in the sequel, Game of Shadows. Now, I feel that these movies really let down the character of Moriarty, and I'll get into this when I talk about the mysteries that are in these movies. But in short, there wasn't enough movie appearances to really show him as the true adversary to Sherlock Holmes. And then finally, we have Stephen Fry as Mycroft Holmes. Most people forget that, yes, Sherlock does have a brother. His character also has the power of deduction, but his actually exceeds Sherlock, but his disdain of field work because of his physique is preventing him from being Sherlock. Now, Mycroft is only in A Game of Shadows, and this movie doesn't do a good job at really showing off Mycroft. It really doesn't show his power of deduction. Instead, he's used as more of a comic relief type character. Now let's dig right into the mysteries that these movies had, starting with the 2009 movie. Now, this movie's mystery is rather simple. Lord Blackwood is sentenced to death and requests to see Sherlock before his execution. He then tells Sherlock that 3 people will die and there's nothing he can do to prevent it. Now, after Lord Blackwood's execution, he then comes back to life. The mystery is not only how did Lord Blackwood come to life, but why did he come back to life? How this mystery plays out is by exploring the underground world of black magic back in 1890s London. So not only do you have witchcraft, but also a secret society, which is a perfect recipe of a mystery. Now, the 3 people who Lord Blackwood say would died, and there's nothing Sherlock could have done to stop any of it. Now, how the rest of this mystery plays out is Lord Blackwood wasn't practicing black magic at all. Instead, he was just using modern science at the time to fool the Black Magic Secret Society into electing him as their leader. And at the end, we see that Lord Blackwood built a chemical weapon to wipe out Parliament, and only his followers would survive because he gave him the antidote, while his followers had no idea that he gave him the antidote. Now, what's the problem with this mystery in the movie? Well, in my opinion, it's the Professor Moriarty connection. And the fact that this movie relies so heavily on him. This mystery of Lord Blackwood coming back to life to create a chemical weapon to fool his followers into electing him as their leader and a new world order using modern science is so strong enough to stand on its own. I could defend the use of Moriarty at the very end when we see him steal a part of the chemical weapon and kill the unfortunate cop that came across him. Now, the use of Moriarty at the very end would have been a nice tease for what was to come from this series. Even Irene being used as an agent of Moriarty would be fine had there not been so many scenes between her and him in this movie. Why not have Sherlock just use his power of deduction to figure that out for himself, since she is the only woman to ever beat him? That way Sherlock would redeem himself and basically have a victory. Still have Irene fall in love with him, obviously, because that's what this character became after a one short story appearance. Now, even though I do have problems with the mystery of this movie, I still recommend anyone who likes Sherlock Holmes or a good mystery movie watch it because it is quite enjoyable. Now that the 2009 movie's out of the way, let's dive right into the mystery of A Game of Shadows. Now, this mystery is not the same as the one in the 2009 movie, obviously. Basically, this centers around Moriarty and his quest to spark warfare on an industrial scale. So basically, World War I. Now, along the way, Dr. Watson gets married and leaves Sherlock to tend to the matters himself, but that's not good enough for Moriarty. See, Moriarty then engulfs Dr. Watson into his scheme, and Sherlock must not only stop Moriarty, but save Watson as well with the help of Mycroft. Now, how is Moriarty doing this? He's staging bombings in France and Germany to get them to start a war, and for the finale, he attempts a political assassination at the peace conference in Switzerland. Now, this movie focuses more on the action-adventure side of Sherlock Holmes and not really his power of deduction, which is okay because not every case that Sherlock takes on is a whodunit murder mystery or who robbed this precious jewel. He did have action-adventure stories. Now, my main gripe with this movie is it feels like it's a closing chapter of a trilogy. This comes to a sudden stop, even with the Moriarty connection being so strong in the first movie, really setting up the climax for the series. Had there been at least one more movie prior to this one, Irene's death could have meant a lot more. Instead, she just dies and the audience moves on. Also, this movie has to do a lot of explaining on how Moriarty got all of these armaments for war. We saw him take apart of the chemical weapon at the end of the first movie, sure, but then he just jumps right into sparking World War I. Now, what would have been more believable is that Moriarty didn't just start bombing the Germans and the French, because bombings are pretty extreme and typically a last resort for someone trying to spark a war. Why not have the middle chapter where it's a murder mystery involving a German or French consulate in London getting murdered and Moriarty planting evidence that it was caused by the one side? Start planting those seeds of doubt before the bombings happen and see if that gets the job done. Now, on screen in this middle chapter, show that the Germans and French agree that this was done by some extremist trying to start a fight and it doesn't lead to war. However, a poor innocent German or Frenchman gets thrown into a prison for execution. Then open A Game of Shadows, the final chapter, with the quote-unquote Germans or French bombing the other as an act of retaliation, and that anger could lead to war, but keep the ending of the German political leader attempting to kill the French political leader at the press conference, because that'll guarantee a fucking war. Now to close off with some final thoughts, both of these movies are actually really good despite my gripes with them. I do prefer to go back and rewatch the first movie from 2009 than A Game of Shadows. Now, the change in writers from the first movie to the second movie was really noticeable, because the writers behind A Game of Shadows seemed to want to rush the climax that was teased in the first movie instead of just allowing that climax to build up and then bang. Now, Guy Ritchie did something that the technology and budget allowed him to do with the Sherlock Holmes movies, and that's take the stories and make it more of an action-adventure series with a whodunit mystery to boot, instead of, tracking down the Star of Rhodesia. Now, while these two movies aren't perfect, I would recommend that if you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes or action-adventure movies, or even the whodunit mysteries like Clue, that you go out and watch these movies. You'll be in for a good time. Now, obviously, that's something I cannot guarantee for each and every one of you, but it does make for a very good ending to this episode.